Hi, and welcome to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast for athletes, coaches, and professionals who want to achieve their goals faster. I'm David Charlton, and I'll be sharing proven methods from leading athletes, coaches, and experts that will help you get the most from your talent. Today's show is sponsored by Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth near Newcastle upon Tyne and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support and excellent rehabilitation services. The vast majority of athletes and executives that I work with enjoy being busy. They're brought up being told that they must work hard to be successful. It's fair to say they're highly committed, tenacious, and determined, driven. Words like that spring to mind. But there can be a downside for these types of people. Burnout can be just around the corner, or they might find themselves entering tournaments, events, when really they should be resting up. They can also lose perspective and work harder and find that their training, their practice is actually quite highly ineffective. And in today's episode, I'm featuring a well-qualified guest who has some very insightful views and offers a range of advice to help athletes, coaches, and executives to manage themselves and the way they go about things better, so that you're in a better position to perform to your maximum on a more consistent basis and also feel better in yourself. Today I'm joined by Nick Grantham, a performance enhancement specialist with over 20 years experience working in high performance sport. Currently working in professional golf and football. Nick's also the author of the Strength and Conditioning Bible. So welcome, Nick.
Cheers, David. Thanks for inviting me on to speak.
Yeah, today we're going to dive into the topic of rest and recovery, the topic which a lot of athletes love. Is that fair to say?
Well, it depends. Some might love it a little bit too much. I think it's certainly an area that I've been interested in since about the early 2000s when I first started working with England netball. I was very fortunate to have two really good coaches from the Southern Hemisphere, a coach from New Zealand, coach from Australia, and combining with our physio, that really introduced me first of all to recovery and regeneration, which I hadn't really seen working in other sports that I'd been with. And all of a sudden we were looking at contrast bathing and cryotherapy and use of hydrotherapies, and it really opened my eyes to it. And it's been something I've been interested ever since. It's been fascinating to see how it's evolved, how there's been kind of this overreaction to it and maybe an underreaction, and now it's coming back to somewhere in the middle where probably some of the science is now starting to support interventions, but also probably refuting some of the interventions that we've long held as being useful. So no, it's a big area, and it's a really interesting one.
In your eyes, what do you see as like quality rest and recovery?
So I think what we've got to realise is that fatigue is going to be multifactorial, and that you've got both a physiological stress that's going to be placed on the body from training and from day-to-day activity, but also there's a big psychological component that will come in terms of that psychosocial and environmental stress. So I think what you want to look for in terms of good quality recovery and regeneration is that multifactorial approach to it, that you first of all try and appreciate that fatigue operates on a continuum. So some fatigue is good to have. And then once you understand that, understanding the different types of fatigue that you've got. So if we go to that sort of continuum, you've got normal training and day-to-day stress, which causes what you could term functional overreaching. And that's what you want in a lot of the training stimulus that you provide, is that you actually want your athlete to feel a level of fatigue physically. And I guess from your side, if you're introducing new psychological interventions, there might be a little bit of fatigue setting in there from new practice. And that's perfectly fine. We want functional overreaching. I think what some athletes then experience is this idea of non-functional overreaching, which is when you're getting fatigue, but there's no real payoff and no real benefit in terms of super compensation at the other end. And that's usually quite a short term. If you've been on the road traveling, we both work with some pro golfers. If they're playing tournament after tournament, they may start to get into a bit of a zone where they're not getting any gains from the fatigue and from the training. And then the worst case is overtraining, and that's quite a rare thing that I think you'd see. A lot of people would say they're overtrained. They're probably just got non-functional overreaching. To be overtrained your coach has got to do a really bad job over an extended period of time, months, even years, of just constantly hammering training and not giving you a chance to recover. And that's when you get a lot of immune suppression, illnesses, and sometimes athletes don't even come back from that. So I think, a little bit of fatigue is fine. And then it's understanding, as I said, as I've outlined in my book, the different types of fatigue. So you've got metabolic fatigue, you've got tissue damage, more neural fatigue, psychological fatigue, and environmental fatigue. And your athletes may experience one or a combination of those to a greater or lesser extent. So again, if we take the example of the golfer we work with, when they're traveling, there's going to be maybe some metabolic fatigue from playing 4 rounds of golf over a course of 4 days. Probably not a huge amount of tissue damage. There's not a lot of significant loading taking place during that, but there would then probably be some psychological fatigue depending on how their round had gone. It can be positive and negative. You could be winning, and that could apply some pressure. And then finally, the environmental fatigue, which is something that I think people often forget. The travel stresses, changing time zones, playing in conditions, hot or cold, that can be very fatiguing as well. So, when we talk about recovery and regeneration, we need to think about fatigue first and foremost and what we're trying to recover from.
I suppose one thing you haven't necessarily mentioned there would be the differences that a person in an individual sport compared to a team sport might find. Obviously, in a team sport, in lots of cases, the coaches will set the plans around training and what have you. Whereas an individual sport, often the players left alone to their own devices. Do you notice like a lot of differences in that respect?
So I think when you're working with individuals, so individual sports are often groups of individuals and they still train together, which is, if you took something like rowing or track and field, they would be an individual sport, but they still train as a training group. Again, things like tennis, golf, it probably is more like an individual, an N of one on tour. And I think the benefits of that is that you can then really start to work out what are the recovery rituals and routines that work for that player. So there are certainly routines that you want to establish that are backed by science and evidence-based that work, but we shouldn't neglect the rituals that a player may have that may on first inspection not seem scientifically validated, but they put that player in a good place from a wellness and a recovery perspective. So I think when you're working with real individuals, it helps you tailor specifically for their needs. The challenge you have with team sports or individuals that train as a team is then almost a kind of a one size fits all. So match day +1, we're now going to go into recovery, and it's going to be some low level aerobic work. It's going to be hydrotherapy, flexibility, mobility. And whilst all of those may be validated in the science, if you've got a squad of 25, it's inevitable that there's going to be people in there that some of that works for them and for others it doesn't. So I think there is potential for the individual to get lost within the group environment.
In that respect, for the team sport player, then is it then up to them to invest on a individual basis in order to improve the rest and recovery? I can't remember which basketball player it is, but I'm sure in the States is like one of the famous guys. He's investing something like $1 million a year in this.
I'm being on his support team. I think what you find is that the athletes do start to understand what allows them to be in a good place post-match, post-tournament, post-competition. And if as an organisation you provide a fairly generic or what I talk about in terms of training and recovery is collective individualisation, you provide strategies that you know are going to work for the group on the whole, and then allowing opportunities to individualise those strategies. So, there may be an athlete that feels, look, cold immersion is just not for me. And if anything, it increases my stress response. So are we going to force them to do an ice bath? Or do we say, okay, well, here's a menu of options, and we could even give them a points system, which is something I've done in the book, and say, look, you need to get 20 points out of today you choose the selection of activities that give you the 20 points. So that then creates some autonomy with the athlete. And again, if an athlete's got autonomy, they're probably going to buy into the session and the recovery that you're putting in place much more than if we just said, you've got to do this, this and this. So I know the teams that I work with, we try and provide a menu. Here are the non-negotiables. These are the 3 things that we want you to complete. And then if you would rather go and do a recovery jog instead of a recovery bike, that's fine. Let's make that on an individual basis and make a decision on that day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That does. When an athlete takes to the field in that chosen sport, naturally you want them to be in a highly motivated place, as relaxed as they're likely to be, and with that sense of self-belief, confidence in their ability. So I can certainly see how that fits by having the individual approach.
I know with one of the downhill mountain bikers I worked with in previous years, categorically did not want to do ice baths because she was just like, look, it puts me in a place that's it's not recovering for me. Let's look at some alternatives. So, we did look at strategies, and whilst we may feel that was the optimal intervention for her, it was 100% not the thing to do. So let's not get you doing that, because we're saying counteracting the very things we're striving for.
So you'll have to often ask yourself the question, is this helping the athlete ultimately, and is this going to impact positively on their performance? Yeah,
I think with training interventions, with anything that you put in place, I think over the years, I've probably matured as a coach. And previously, where it was like, I would be telling you what to do because I know best, I've come to the realization athletes know very well. They've been doing their sport and activity for decades before we turn up and say, oh, actually, I think you should change X, Y, and Z. So I think listening to the athlete about what works and developing a strategy together that allows them to be in a good place is a great starting point. And then the recovery pyramid that I developed with Mark Jarvis, one of my colleagues, gives us that foundation. There's 4 levels to it, and at each level there's a variety of strategies, and that gives you almost like a hierarchical structure of interventions. But then running through the pyramid is this mortar that holds it all together, which is that individual focus and personal take on it. So, at all times, these are our strategies, but recognizing for this individual, actually, maybe we're going to bypass level 1 and go straight to a level 4 intervention as an idea.
Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that pyramid?
Yeah, so it came out of confusion, really. So in about 2002, 2003, I think we were doing stuff with England netball, and then that wasn't a really mainstream sport, but Paula Radcliffe, I think she won a world championships, and then the England rugby won the World Cup, and they were using ice baths. So all of a sudden you saw this massive overreaction in sport, and everyone started getting into recovery. And what we saw at the English Institute of Sport when I was working there with Mark Jarvis was everyone was chucking like every potential intervention at an athlete. And it was a bit of a scattergun approach, and just chuck stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And it didn't make sense to us as strength coaches, because if we're going to write a training program, there's a logical sequence that you would follow, and kind of foundations that you need to lay. And that's where we came up with this idea of the recovery pyramid, was to try and make sense of all of this noise and find out what would be the logical structure. So we developed 4 levels. The first level being looking at sleep, nutrition and body management. And we felt those were 3 fundamental things that athletes should be working on before they go to the level 2. And level 2 was looking at more around periodization, reactive programming and ongoing monitoring. So real simple stuff. Like levels 1 and 2 is like your basics. Before you get onto level 3, where you'll be looking at your hydrotherapies, compression garments, muscle stim, and then your top end would be sort of stress diagnostics, psychological interventions and environmental interventions and cryotherapy. So we laid it out, and we've revised it a few times, and I've kind of condensed it down to a recovery cycle, and it's just those bottom 3. Because for me, look after your sleep, look after your nutrition, and take care of your body management, which is how you recover, flexibility, mobility. And if you've got those three things dialed in, then you can start to think about, okay, do we use some compression garments? Do we use some cryotherapy? But what we were seeing back in the early 2000s, where athletes were doing all these sophisticated interventions, and they're kind of putting a cherry on top of a cake that didn't really exist. Mm-hmm. So that's why we came up with the idea, was try and make some sense of it for ourselves. And interestingly, as the research is coming out, probably those lower level interventions, there's more and more evidence to come out and support sleep, nutrition, flexibility, mobility, body management type things. And your higher level strategies, the research is probably more sparse and not as solid. It's not to say you shouldn't use them and apply them, but you've got to consider carefully what's the cost benefit when you're using it.
Yeah, it'll be very easy to, like you mentioned, crazes there, to look at the quick fixes or what's in at the moment and get sucked up with that.
I think, athletes in sports are always looking for the next thing, the edge, the 1%, and they forget about the other 99% that needs to be taken care of. And no amount of sitting in an ice bath is going to help you recover if your sleep is lousy, your nutrition is off, and you're not doing sensible things in and around your training. You haven't got a program that's written. That was what we thought. And I think, more and more science backs it up. And interestingly, I was just reading before we came on here, the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, in their most recent newsletter, I think it's number 65, they've done a review of the psychology of injury reduction and injury prevention. And actually they've looked at athletes that are good at mindfulness, wellness, have relaxation interventions as part of their recovery or training. The evidence points to and suggests that actually they have a reduced incidence of injury. So, the mechanisms of why that is aren't known, but it probably along the lines of, if you can cope with those stresses and strains a little bit better and have ways of relaxing, then you're probably going to make better decisions about when to train and how to train further down the line. So it's interesting. I think there's lots of research coming out.
Yeah, and imagine in that case, your clarity of thought, your decision making is going to be a lot better, and then you'll have the physical aspect to it as well, where your body is just going to be slightly looser, and like you mentioned about being more relaxed, so you're less likely to pick up injuries.
Yeah.
So it gets back down to what you hear a lot in top class sport, is the better athletes do the boring things really well.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we're talking about are the simple, boring things.
I mean, we always talk about being brilliant at the basics. And I think, before we came on this call, we were talking about the most recent major in golf, and they, the guy that won it, they talked about consistency. It's not that he does probably any one thing amazingly better than the others. It's just that he nails stuff on a regular basis. And I think that's the same, whether it's your training or whether it's your recovery. The best athletes are professional. They take care of all the small things that then give them the longevity of career. Because I think you can see people that burn brightly, but for very short periods of time, and then their career is dogged by injury, or they just can't really hit those heights they did initially. So I think like all athletes, get good at your level 1 and 2 on the recovery pyramid before you start worrying about all the fancy stuff.
So obviously we've talked about their crazes and how people can get pushed because of maybe quick fixes. What other sort of challenges, barriers do athletes put up, when they're faced and when they're looking at resting up and recovery?
So I think it's very hard for an athlete to be told, have a day off, or certainly the ones that you want to be working with. It's hard because they're the ones that are pushing all the time. So I've certainly seen when I've had athletes, to tell them to relax and recover, it's a hard sell because we are constantly fed, and even more so in social media. Our social media diet is about the grind, the hustle. Let's train again. Let's do another workout. And what most of the people behind that sort of drivel don't realize is you need to recover from your training to get the adaptations you're seeking. Otherwise, you just put yourself into a deeper and deeper hole, and you don't come out. So I think it's very hard to convince an athlete that's getting bombarded with all this information to actually have a day off and relax, and it's okay to sit on the couch or go to the cinema or go for a walk or just spend some time with your family. That's absolutely vital, both from a physiological recovery, but from an emotional and a psychological. We've got players come back from matches, just spend the next day with your family can have a massive regenerative effect emotionally and psychologically. For some players and athletes, it might have the opposite, but I think, often, they throw up the fact that I should be training, I shouldn't be resting, I need to be out, I need to be doing more. I had a poor performance at the weekend, so I've got to train even harder. So I think there's almost a bit of a guilt associated with, or perception of guilt that you're not training. And I know when I first wrote programs, I wrote programs for people to train on sort of Boxing Day and over Christmas, because you hear all this stuff. Oh, so-and-so was out training on Christmas Day. Well, do you know what? Maybe they were, but actually it's a time to be with your family and spend time doing that. So what I started to do was I would write programs and, thinking they're going to train on Christmas Day and Boxing Day and Christmas Eve. The reality was they probably weren't. So what I started to do was front load and do a little bit more training in the weeks leading up to that, and then saying to them, have 5 days at home. Not completely off, but, unstructured training, do what you want, recover, spend time with your family, eat and drink and enjoy yourself. But remember, you're going to train hard going into it and train hard coming out of it. And that's a far more balanced approach than, we've all got to be training on Christmas Day, which is, you can do that if you want, but I'd rather sit at home with a box of Quality Street and watch the Queen's speech,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's it. And then the other thing we talked about before is the shortcuts. Athletes want the shortcuts. They don't want to do level 1 and 2. They want to put on a pair of compression tights and take a supplement that's going to give them the magic bullet. Which there may be times when an athlete isn't nailing the basics, but we're in the middle of a competition and we will give them those high level strategies as a quick fix. But that's not all they're going to be getting long term.
Going back to your point there about the hustle, the sort of the grind, I would imagine, especially in a team sport, but it will be the same in individual sports, coaches and the general culture is going to have a big impact as well on the athlete. So if they're hearing messages from coaches, you've got to keep doing and working harder, then some can sort of lose some sort of perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And whether it's the coaching staff or whether it's social media or whether it's what people are reading in popular press and magazines, where we get our information and the information that we trust is really important. And I see that so much with the recreational weekend warriors that I've worked with in the past. The high level recreational triathletes, age groupers, seems to be a particular issue for endurance based athletes, because I've got to get the miles in. I've got to go out on a Sunday and I've got to do a big ride and a brick session. And, these are people that are normally holding down tough jobs, got a family life, and then they're piling on the training. And I found that's kind of endurance group, some of the hardest ones to convince. Do you know what? You're probably better off not going for that ride for 4 hours. Do a shorter, sharper effort, and then spend some time with your family who haven't seen you for all week, and then you're disappearing out the door to go and do a brick session. It's like people just lose sight of what's important and what will actually ultimately drive performance, I think, in the end.
I see that so much with the people I work with, often, especially if you look at the lower level professional golfer or the highly motivated amateur golfer. They'll be on the driving range or on the golf course for 5-6 hours practicing. They're doing their training on top of that. Then they've got the competitive play. And generally what I find, it boils down to a lack of trust in their skill set and their ability. And they have a skewed thinking in that way. It's
like they're kind of like cramming for the exam every single night. And it's not gonna work,
Yeah, it's quite stressful.
Yeah, I think, again, that comes back to those level 2 strategies of periodizing your program and having reactive programs that, can adapt and flex with your situation. And you see so many people that I've got to get my miles in, or I've got to get my practice rounds in. But you've got a social occasion that you've got to go to as well, So actually, if you've got a program that can flex and adapt a little bit and say, right, well, rather than trying to go out at 5 o'clock in the morning before the family wedding, why don't you just shift some of your training before and after and have that day as a dedicated day off, and then you're not going to be getting all the stress from your partner because you're disappearing off out the hotel room to go and play a round of golf. And I think people just get it so wrong when it comes to recovery.
Yeah, they lose sight of the bigger picture, don't they, and it all.
Yeah, and I find it, you could possibly understand it for elite athletes where livelihoods and livings are on the line. I could probably justify it a little bit more with them if they were like sacrificing everything else, but even then I'd question it. But for your recreational age groupers, club, amateur level guys that are like just at the exclusion of everything else, I'm like, really? It baffles me. You're getting a plastic trophy, yet your marriage is disintegrating because you've been on the practice course all week. It's strange.
Now you're bordering on the psychology side. Yeah.
I think they're also interlinked, aren't they?
They are hugely. I find a lot of that an athlete's identity is such a huge factor in all of this, regardless of whether they're, like you say, amateur, youngster, professional. They can lose sense of who they are, or they can have their identity is, I'm a golfer, I'm a footballer, and they forget about all of the other things in their life.
We see that equally, the support staff working within sport who very much identify themselves as the strength and conditioning coach, the sports scientist, the psychologist, the team coach. And again, within that sort of culture, there's this idea that I've got to put the hours in, I've got to be the last to leave, first to arrive. And again, that doesn't make for a healthy career and doesn't make you really good at making good decisions when you're writing your training programs. You give your athletes days off and time off to recover. We need to do that as well. So yeah, it blends into every aspect of life.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I know certainly from time to time I'll struggle with that myself, being self-employed and working for myself. And yeah, you really do have to look after yourself and treat it really seriously. That leads me on quite nicely to the question of how do you treat and work with athletes who don't take recovery seriously? What do you say to them?
So I think, I'm really there to facilitate what they're doing. I'm not the person in most sports that I work with, the buck doesn't stop with me. I'm not the person writing the checks. So, you recognize that I can advise you. I'll give you my advice based on 20 plus years experience, based on all the evidence base. If you choose to ignore that, you're a big boy or a girl, that's your decision. I'd like to think that over time, the longer you work with athletes, and particular athletes, the more you can start to sow the seeds, and it becomes their idea then, and then run with it. But it is challenging. I just think you just have to become quite thick-skinned and keep advising, and ultimately they make the decision. I can't force someone to get into an ice bath, or I can't force someone to go to the cinema and just have an afternoon off.
It'll boil down to the relationship again, won't it, and trust and building that over a period of time.
Yeah, and I think so much of that, so much of what we do in sport and all walks of life, it's that relationship between the support staff and the athlete. If they trust you, if they believe in what you're doing, if they can see a track record of success, they're far more likely to buy into the interventions that you're suggesting.
Without doubt. So, given we've chatted there for around about half an hour, what would you say are the 3 big takeaways for athletes looking to improve the way they go about their rest and recovery? So,
I'd suggest figuring out the types of fatigue that they're susceptible to. And we've talked about that at the top of the show. So what makes them tired, and then looking at, again, I go back to that recovery pyramid and say, what are the interventions that you're currently looking at? Is your nutrition on point? Is your sleep on point? Have you got things that you do to manage your body effectively, flexibility, mobility? Are you taking care of those basics? Have you got a program? So I'd look at those first two levels in the recovery pyramid and, understand what type of fatigue you've got, and then are you doing anything to combat that? And then I would, recommend putting together some sort of monitoring over a short period. I'm always surprised at how many athletes don't have a training diary and don't record just very simply how they're feeling from day to day. So, record what they're doing, track what they're doing, and then create almost like a menu and that point system that I talked about before, where you say, right, okay, I'm going to get 5 points from my nutrition. I'm going to get 10 points from my sort of actual recovery interventions, and develop the points each day. This is something I've done with athletes, is each day hit 20 points. And then you can see on days where they maybe got 10 or 15, well, what were the barriers then? So it's really just encouraging athletes to understand fatigue, understand the strategies they can put in place, and then actually reflect on, well, what am I putting in place and how does that then make me feel? So that you can actually drill down into what's effective, rather than just, I'm going to put some compression tights on, eat a protein bar, and I don't know, wear some blue light goggles and that'll make me feel amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're talking there, a lot of it is certainly about taking some time out and really questioning them, helping them take some responsibility and having some control over this.
With some of the people that we work with, one of the things I looked at was how many tournaments they were doing back to back and looking at results and going, well, there's definitely a pattern here between the number of times you compete and then the results towards the latter end. So, is it worth it entering those? Do we need to give yourself, you do 2 tournaments and then take a break, and then do 2 tournaments and take a break? And if you need to do 3 or 4, there's a really definite performance decision behind it, and we're going to give you all the recovery strategies to support that. So I think there's so many people don't reflect on what they're doing and how that's affecting their performances.
So yeah, and then when you're talking about the recording and tracking side of things, that is absolutely vital, isn't it? To be able to then 2 or 3 months further down the line, look back at where you have gone wrong, what you've done well.
Yeah. I'm shocked, stunned, and a little bit amazed still at how many people don't have a simple diary. And I'm not talking like something sophisticated, just a little journal, and it can have some happy faces and some sad faces, just some different metrics that you look at. But so many people don't. So how do you know what created a good performance, and how do you know what led up to a poor performance? And you're putting your finger in the air and just hoping for the best, aren't you?
Yeah, and I wonder if that just gets back down to that culture we were talking about before, the let's do, and the grind. And a lot of people have forgotten what a pen and a bit of paper is all about now, haven't they? They're just on their phones all the time.
Yeah. You don't need sophisticated apps and technology and data management systems. You just need to record a few vital things consistently, and it kind of opens the window into your performance, and then that gives you the insight to put together a sensible recovery program to help drive performance.
Huge. That's brilliant. Thanks for sharing those bits of advice.
Problem.
Fantastic. Whereabouts can the listeners find you then, Nick?
Okay, so the usual sort of social media, Twitter and Instagram. So Twitter is Coach Nick G, and I recently changed my Instagram one, so I'm pretty sure it's Nick Grantham _coach. And then my website is nickgrantham.com, which is currently being updated. So depending on when you watch this podcast, it'll either look a little bit clunky or it'll look much better and a sharper website. So yeah, those are probably the 3 best places to find me.
Brilliant. Again, thanks very much.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
I'd like to give a big thanks to today's sponsors, Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth near Newcastle upon Tyne and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support and excellent rehabilitation services. Thank you for listening to Demystifying Mental Toughness today. To sign up for tips and advice to help you be the best that you can be, go to www.sport-excellence.co.uk and sign up to the Mental Edge newsletter.